Welcome to the Working Wellbeing podcast. Delighted, really excited about today's episode. We've got Nicola Hogan, who is, I'm going to try and read out your job title here. I want to ask you about this. So, Global Psychosocial Safety and Wellbeing Lead at Fonterra.
Well done. Nailed it. Well done.
I did have it written down. I'm cheating, in fairness. Yeah, thank you so much for your time today, but Nicola, really appreciate it. And should we kick off with the job title? Tell us a little bit more about you and what you do and what that job title means.
Oh, that's a great question. I think it's there just to confuse people. No, and just go, what's that all about? No, it's a really contentious topic, actually, what to call yourself in this space. I think the reason being that psychosocial, not only do people trip over that word, but some people find it distancing, and it actually can make psychologists, more of the sort of, ivory towered people, they're inaccessible, etc. But why that was chosen was because we want to make that word separate from psychological safety, and B, we want to actually make people ask those questions and go, what does that mean? And make it become part of the vernacular. To be perfectly honest, if people don't say exactly that word, but they know what it means, then that's fine too. That's the kind of first part. But what does it actually mean? Long story short, it means managing psychosocial risk within a workplace. So measuring it, managing it, and making sure we review it to see if it's still working.
Yes, I want to ask you more about that. Although you've also got the and wellbeing lead. So is that for anyone who doesn't know what psychosocial risk is? It's like, well, and wellbeing.
That's a good point. I think of one as the process and the other one as the outcome.
Ooh.
So that sounded more sage than I intended it to be. No. So where you have, if we're managing psychosocial risk properly, then the impact is wellbeing. But of course, we know that there's so much that goes into wellbeing. It's not just work. You actually, there's a whole bunch of other factors and variables that go into it. So if we can impact some of those too, that's absolutely terrific. But we know where we have the biggest impact is people's experience of work. This is in a workplace, of course. Yeah.
Yes. I love that. I love all the work. I don't know if you've seen the work that Deloitte do around human sustainability and well-being as an outcome and all that stuff. I love that stuff. When I first read that, it was a real kind of light bulb moment for me, because I was like, this is what I've been trying to describe to people, but they've articulated it. They've articulated it.
And how important is that, right? To give people language that they can use and that means something that's not. And I think we can get too caught up on terminology and especially as psychologists, I think that really is something that can be quite distancing, as I said. But it doesn't matter if you get it right. Like if it's what we're supposed to be talking about, the stuff we know that makes an impact, and by that I mean it's evidence based. Who cares?
Fair enough. So psychosocial risk is an interesting one. So you're based in Australia, obviously. I'm sat here in the UK. I would say that in the UK, psychosocial risk is a relatively new term for a lot of people. Obviously, we had the 5003 standard, which launched, a few years ago now. But that didn't really seem to touch the sides at the time, as far as I could see. I am seeing it creeping in, especially in more kind of safety-conscious environments, whether construction firms, pharmaceuticals, FMCGs, these sorts of organisations. But would you say that Australia is slightly further ahead when it comes to psychosocial risk? Do more people know what it means?
I would like to think so. There's two separate questions, I think. Like, do we think that we're, a little bit ahead? And do people know what it means? I think two very different things. I think legislation-wise, we might be, and basically exactly the same thing happened to us, whereby there was all this stuff in place. We had a model code of practice, and then it's nothing sort of changed. So we've actually had it as part of legislation since about 2010. It just didn't make it. It wasn't hitting the road. So only in the last sort of 2 or 3 years has it really started to ratchet up in all sorts of different ways. Of course, being a federation, we've got national laws that are different and distinct from each of the states and territories, which makes it extra fun when you're running a large company and your directors. You need to look after all sorts of different, but we just go with basically what's the highest and the most sort of stringent, and then sort of work the way down from there. So yeah, very similar.
Oh yeah. So would you suggest that legislation is the way to go? Because obviously we've stopped one step short of that in the UK. So we've got standards and aspects of safety and well-being are written into legislation. We have health and safety laws, but we've stopped one step short of saying psychological health and safety and psychosocial risk are written into legislation and law. Do you think that's the way that we should go?
This is a really contentious question. Exactly
Yeah.
why
Why
one that
ask you?
needs why well, yeah, exactly one that needs discussion. Heart of hearts, I'd love to believe that we didn't need to have it, but it's like most things whereby if it, I'm seeing so much more discussion. Like even in Australia, there's so many people talking about it being new, and I have to get over going, it's been like this, but that tells me that they didn't know about it beforehand, and we only start to care about things when they're kind of put in front of our face. So I'd like to believe no, it's not necessarily, but I've not seen it work where it hasn't been legislated. So
Yeah.
yeah, I
Yeah,
think
it's
that's kind
fair.
of really
It's
tough.
fair. And that time frame's really interesting because I was when the ISO standard launched, I think it was June 22 or 23, one or the other, and I in like August, a month later, I was like, right, the world's gonna change. Nothing
So
changed,
we thought the same thing. Yeah,
and
exactly.
nothing
When it came
changed for
through, we're like,
a
oh,
year,
this
two
is going to
years,
be.
and now finally I'm seeing more organizations talk to me about it, and they're doing audits around it and all the rest of it. And maybe it just takes that time. Maybe it just takes that time to feed through.
Yeah, I think it really does. But at the same time, yeah, it's sort of watch and learn. Like we thought, maybe 10 years is a bit long. Maybe that's 10, 15 is a bit too long. And I think it's the balance between introducing legislation and going, right, tomorrow. And some of the regulators in Australia have done a terrific job of really easing organisations into it. But even then, it's been a case of you can sort of see it ratcheting up where it was actually going to need to have a plan. Now it's starting to become enforceable, etc. So I think you can't just dump it and then go for it. But I think, especially organisations, of size, really don't have much excuse now to say we didn't know and we shouldn't. And I know that sounds quite punitive and but I think it's when the stakes are as high as they are, I think that it's something that we can't ignore anymore. So.
Yeah, and that's fair enough. The moral imperative is always there, because it's the right thing to do. But let's be honest, within businesses, it tends to come down to, is it a legal requirement? Are we going to see some sort of business and performance benefit out of this? Because
Yeah,
that's what keeps everybody in a job, right?
yeah,
I'm not
exactly.
naive enough to think that we should all just be, you know, just aim for happiness, and that we're all
Oh my gosh,
incredibly
yeah.
happy and that the business can crumble in the background, Maybe I do kind of believe that. Maybe I do. But if you want to start, influencing a business and senior leaders and all the rest of it, you've got to speak that language, right?
Oh, absolutely. But I think that's a really good point that you make about the business imperative. And that's one that I think, can get a little bit lost with the legislative overlay. And that is also because obviously we do start small and then you need to build precedent and all that sort of stuff when you talk about legislation. And when it is a bit lower, then you can sort of basically meet the requirements and then tick it off. But the conversation about how impactful managing this is on your bottom line, I think gets lost. And that's one that, I sort of see eyes wide and go, oh, this is going to make a huge positive impact. You're like, yeah, this is not just there's lots of reasons to do this, and it's reputational as well as retention impacts, etc. So it's really something I think that can cross those paths. But obviously it's the carrot versus stick.
Yeah, no,
What's going to
totally.
get the
A-
attention. Yeah.
And generationally as well, I feel like the new generations are looking for different things from their employers, right? Obviously, if you talk about the links to physical health and safety, nobody wants a job where they might get their arm cut off. Like
Yeah.
that's a prerequisite, So that does become a bit of not a tick box exercise, but we need to do that. We need to do that to make sure people aren't at physical harm. But like you
Mm.
say, actually the positive side of it and actually striving for a workplace where people could be happy and thrive and all the rest of it, people expect that to a certain extent. They're looking for it
Mm.
in
Yeah.
a way that perhaps they weren't a decade ago.
I think so. But at the same time, I'd say we have to be careful of overstating what that is, because actually I often talk about psychosocial risk without overtly even talking about it. The management of change, for example, we don't even need to mention psychosocial risk. It's good that we do sometimes to talk about the impact that it can have. But in that circumstance, I think even, 10, 15 years, we all know that going through a really poorly managed organizational change, is rubbish and it impacts everything. Financial well-being as well, when you redundancies and you have poor communication, etc. So I think if we start to really unpack what psych risk is, And we see that actually this is something that's been affecting people for ages. We just haven't had the language to talk about it.
Yeah.
I think that's like, I think like PTSD, for example, if you're talking about mental illness, I use this example that actually, hundreds of years ago it was war sick, and then it became shell shock, and then we went, in 82, we had a diagnosis, but it's been around before 1982.
So true.
Yeah.
That is so true. That's definitely getting clipped up. No, because that is so true that you speak to some organizations and they think that, you're going to tell them something mystical and new around well-being and psychosocial risk. Tell us this new thing about well-being, and it's like it's workload and change and relationships, and they're like, yeah, we do that. And I'm like, yeah, I know you.
Yeah.
It's a proper framework and a system to be able to manage it effectively.
And not just throwing stuff and going like, does this work? And yeah, that's exactly right. The framework and the management practices. And I think that's where the ISO 45003 really did quite a good job about. But again, it's like, why aren't we picking it up? My sort of personal opinion is it was a bit overwhelming. And it's just sort of, if you're not a safety nerd, then you might just look at it and think, if I don't have to,
Yeah,
are there other standards that I can focus my attention on?
That's fair. That's fair. I'm certainly a well-being nerd and a psychologist by background. I read it and I had to read it a few times. I was, some of the language in it I just didn't understand. So if I can't understand it,
yeah, exactly. And I'm not saying it's not good, but as a way to start, it can be overwhelming. I think that's where we need to sort of have plans. And, and that comes back to the reasonably practical thing. When you've got a large organization, you can get people like us in, but smaller organizations, especially, we just look at that and just be like, yet another thing that they've got to check off. And I think we've really got to have compassion for that and provide support appropriately.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I will come back to that because I want to ask you about like the future of this space and all the rest of it. But let's just take a step back just for a second. And I wanted to ask you about your career. So, we've learned about your job title now. Have you always been a global psychosocial safety and wellbeing lead? There you go, I read it again. What led you to that? What led you to that point? Where did it start?
Oh my gosh, how far back do we go? I certainly haven't. I was actually, my first sort of career, I suppose, was I was a secondary school teacher.
Oh,
So
really?
yeah, I taught English and psychology in England for a little while too, actually. So spent a bit of time there. Oh my gosh, I have the names that I describe it aren't what I should describe it. It is a beautiful little place called Letchworth Garden City and Hertfordshire, around that sort of area in St Albans and lots of stuff. It was a while ago now, so I have to kind of dig back to the annals in my mind. But I always had an interest in skin. I'd done half the sort of studying and all up. It was 8 years of full-time study, so it took a while. And then did educational developmental psych. So worked in sort of the barriers between person and their education and developmental challenges throughout the lifespan. So that was pretty cool. And then someone just really tapped me on the shoulder and said, how do you feel about working with adults in this space and working in well-being in the workplace? And I just sort of thought, terrified? Is that the right answer? And that was about 10 years ago. I really cut my teeth in consultancy and that was really cool. So I could just like lift the hood essentially in lots of different organizations and just sort of see, what's really happening and start to poke around there and develop mental health strategies. Again, it was really focused on psych risk management, but seeing that from early days to now is pretty cool. And then I moved internally in bank, and now I'm at Fonterra. Yeah, so I jumped across the ditch to New Zealand, where our colleagues are over there. So it's been really cool, really great experience.
Nice one. That transition from consultancy to in-house is interesting. So I'm a consultant, right? And I have always been. So for the last 15 years, I've worked with lots of different organizations. As you've said, the main benefit of that is I get to poke around in lots of different organizations and see all sorts of different culture. I don't know whether you had this experience. The thing that always strikes me about that is there are some interesting differences, but what always strikes me is the similarities.
That's exactly what I was going to say. That is, yes, you just end up sort of saying very, very similar things. And I was actually talking to a colleague, I used to work in clinical practice, about this actually with individuals and people, like whereby, so don't you feel like after a while you sort of say the same thing? Like, yeah. But the trick is how to get that message so you're not just, grabbing chunks of, work that you've done previously, but B, that in a way that matches that, either individual that you're working with or the organization. I think that's the part that I don't think we get enough credit to. Or that's what I used to tell myself anyway, and make myself feel better about.
No, that's interesting. So what you mean there is like the language around it and how you communicate those things is quite subtle, maybe. But I don't know whether you had this, but every organization I worked with or work with on a consultancy basis, they'll try and convince me that I've never worked anywhere like this. And
Yes.
the rest of it, I'm like, do you employ people? Yes. Well, then it's probably pretty similar,
Yeah.
And that's not strictly true. What's that, sorry?
To be told that we don't like to be told that we want to be special.
But you are right. There are those even subtle differences that you cannot land a message in the same way in one industry or organization as you can another. You can't just pick it up and put it back down again in that other organization, and it will have the same impact. So that's interesting.
I think you learn. I found that out the hard way. I think because I thought it's the same. Like what? And actually, if you talk about those sort of big four motivators of, when we're talking about the financial benefit, the moral imperative, the reputational one, and the legal one, like some will just be like, do you know how many legislative requirements I have? Like, you don't scare me, And others are like, oh, that's terrifying. And others are like, actually, the main reason we should be doing this is because it's the right thing to do. And you think, oh, that's nice. Yeah, it is. Yeah, so I think it really varies.
Absolutely. So what inspired that transition then? Because as we said, there are some benefits to working in a consultancy position. I know what I feel the drawbacks are, but what inspired that move over towards an in-house role?
I think it was really a case of putting my money where my mouth is. Like, I think there's a, and I'm sure you don't do this, but in consultancy, sometimes you sort of step back and just go, they should just do this, this, and this, and actually, and you have some inkling about how big wheels, turn slowly and how interconnected and messy it is. But I think it's really tricky to say, to sort of have any weight in any skin in the game until you've actually been in those big places. And as you say, people are the same. And when there's lots of it, when we're all trying to work we want to have different goals, etc., then things become really tricky to do. So it's just a case of going, put your money where your mouth is.
I like it. Whilst having not worked in-house, I do feel like an empathizer. That I feel like I've done it long enough that I'm like, I get it. I get it. When I'm like, just do this, just do that. And they're like, well, we can try, but it'll take a while. So the frustration or one of the reasons that would inspire me to move in-house, and I would definitely consider it, is that I would like to see something through on a long-term basis as well. That's the other frustration I have with consultancy is that you get involved with a really interesting project and we seem to be making some progress, and then the budget runs out, the priorities shift, the contact leaves, and suddenly it's difficult to see that through. And I've been involved with projects and you almost like, I just wish I could see how that ended up.
Oh my gosh, all the time. Absolutely. And I was quite lucky in the consultancy because we had like long-standing relationships and it was like that sort of trusted advisor status where you kind of pop in and out and all that sort of stuff. But it's just not the same as being there. And also there are, only so many things that you get told as a consultant, right? Like you can sign as many NDAs as you like, but you're not really going to know what the real picture is because people are professional and that's a good thing. But yeah, I think seeing it through is definitely part of it and just constantly problem solving. I think that's pretty cool as well. Like being able to sort of go, yeah, the budget has run out. So what do you do? Where do you go with this? So it's really cool. I think a lot of consultants think, don't you just get bored? And I'm like, I think you can boring people are bored.
Yeah, absolutely. You touched on something there, and it's a question that we ask fairly regularly on this podcast. They're about the attributes that you think make for a successful or an effective well-being leader. Do you think there's a set of kind of key attributes?
Oh, that's a good question. I actually think over and above the ones that I'm sure have been hashed, and perhaps this one has been too, but compassion. Like, I think you sort of need to go, like, we can get quite sort of, militant, I think, because we're protecting people, we're looking after people, and we're, but everybody has various reasons why they are or aren't doing things. And I think if you get too militant and say like, oh, it's because of your budget and you don't care and you're on feeling, or you just, then I think that we really dismiss people and don't meet them where they are. And I don't think that's fair. So I think you sort of have to bring, a quiet compassion, not one that means that you don't get your message heard, but yeah, real sort of quiet compassion with the other one. Yeah.
So that is a good one, and one that we don't hear that often. But that ability to empathize, because you're so passionate about health and well-being and all the rest of it, right? And you're just like, come on, you can do this. And then when they don't move quite as quickly as you would like them to, it's easy to say, well, they just don't care. They don't care as much as I do. But it might be 100 other things that you kind of failed to see because you're not in their position.
Yeah, or you haven't taken the time to, for your own reasons and all that sort of stuff, to find out what their position is, right? And I think that's what helped. And I was still learning that space, of course. I still get frustrated, but I think that's what helped being a teacher, was that, I'd be around and I'd talk for a long time. Teachers who'd be like, they're just little, insert. And I thought, where's the passion, etc. And I thought, well, it's actually, if they aren't engaged, that's on you. So, and if you take that as your responsibility, and you may not ever get there, but I think as soon as you give up, as soon as you say, that child or that executive, sometimes not that different, then you've lost, that's it.
Yeah.
You're toast. And it can get really, really, really easy to be disenchanted when you do that, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. I love you reading the read across between teaching and influencing in a business setting. My wife will love that as well because she's a teacher, although primary school teacher. Although there you go.
That's very hard. It's very hard to do. I couldn't do that.
But I'll have to tell her. The way that you influence the children in the classroom. That's what these execs need to do in the boardroom, right?
Yeah, we're not that different. It's what you said before. We're not. We have carryover skills, I think, that we don't pay much sort of attention to. Teachers are really bad at that. They'll just sort of think, oh gosh, I can only be in the classroom. But there's a lot that you need to do in those roles. And, you walk into, who knows what, everybody's in different stages of their emotions. And people are people, like what you said before. Not that different.
Absolutely. You said that the latest installment of your career is the role that I've said a couple of times within Fonterra. Can you tell me a little bit about what that looks like in terms of, so is that a standalone team, or do you work with HR, or is it more with health and safety? Is it separate? What's the size of your team? How does that look?
Oh, that's a really great question. So it's in flux at the moment because it's a very, very new team. So we've only been around for about less than a year or so. And there's a lot of movement because of that very reason. So typically in Australia, I've worked, and though I'm in Australia, I sort of talk about New Zealand because that's essentially where we report through health and safety. Big debate about whether or not it should be through health and safety and P&C. In my mind, it's, again, mainly just because my experience sits a bit more in health and safety, but you need a connection in with P&C HR. Really, really, really important, especially because you've got sexual harassment legislation that's separate to workplace and health and safety in Australia, and that tends to be managed through HR primarily. So you just need to be able to make sure that you're speaking to each other a lot. So we're forming those connections in Fonterra, which is really cool. And yeah, our role sits within global health, safety and wellbeing. So we get to sit along colleagues in critical risk who are looking at, 8-story dryers that, dry milk and all the associated risks with that, and how we can integrate psychosocial risk and make sure that it just doesn't sit on its own. So it's really, 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 really cool. It's a big job to introduce it, but we've got some terrific colleagues, so it's really exciting.
Yeah. And what's the size of your team?
So my team directly is actually only 2 of us.
Okay. Yeah. Well, sometimes it's only one.
Yeah. So that's a good way of looking at it. I like that. But yeah, no, there's only 2 of us. So, but that's quite specifically on psych risk. And look, there are organisations of our size that have 0. So I shouldn't be complaining. Not that I am. But yeah, it's we essentially just try and weave psych risk meaningfully throughout the org and focus on that risk that's the most prominent, and then sort of work our way down from there. We want to make sure that we're not just sort of mapping it directly onto critical risk and physical risk, because it doesn't work. But yeah, making sure we do it in a meaningful way. So that's pretty cool.
And it's different. So this is a bit of a leading question, really. But one of the things that I'm really interested in at the moment is the future of this space and the future of these roles. Look, I may as well put my cards on the table. I recorded a video about it last week where I said that one of my predictions for the future, certainly in the UK, was that we'd see well-being roles move more towards health and safety and perhaps away from HR. That's not to say, as you say, the connection to HR is really important. Believe it is. But what I was trying to say, there were two things. Number one, because of the legislation, potential legislation, all the rest of it, I think it might move that way. But that's not to say that it will become subsumed into health and safety. I think my personal take is that dedicated health, dedicated well-being roles or psychosocial risk roles, or whatever you want to call it, will still be needed and will potentially increase in the future. But I've heard some people say the opposite. I don't know. What's your take on that?
What's the argument for the opposite? Because I'm interested to hear.
Well, so the opposite is the main argument I've heard is that well-being and psychosocial risk should be everybody's responsibility. Therefore, we're going to imbue it into everybody's role. So HR have a responsibility, health and safety have a responsibility, IT, finance, chief operating officer, they all have a responsibility. So let's just kind of try and bring it into everybody's role. And I agree with that. I agree that's a great picture. But for me, that doesn't mean that you don't need somebody who's steering the ship, a dedicated role, even if it is one or two people. It doesn't need to be a huge department, but even if it is just because everybody works on a computer doesn't mean that you don't need a head of IT. It's my take.
And look, I would absolutely agree with that. I think perfect world, again, it's how far into the future are we looking? Because if it's far, far into the future, that sounds like an excellent proposition. I think the more that we segment off knowledge and we be the sort of harbinger of doom as our physical safety colleagues in the past have been, and the sort of wowzers and the fun police, I think, is what they kind of were known for in the past. The more that we sort of isolate ourselves. However, I absolutely agree. I think when you do dilute it to that sense, you end up with people who have huge roles and have busy lives, and then I've got to do this psych risk stuff, I've got to do this physical risk stuff, and it becomes a tick box. So I think it's dependent on the size of the organization, of course, but where it is reasonably practicable, and I think that's anywhere, not to put a number on it, but if you're talking up without specific people in these roles, look at the cost benefit. Like, I think over and above, what are we doing if we're not giving this sort of knowledge to our people?
Yeah. So you're full on for my leading question there.
Yeah,
because that's what I think as well. I think it's an interesting one to think about because we need to be open for challenge around this, right? And if there are other ways that it can be structured in a way that it will make more of a difference to an organization, then that's fine. But for me, I mean, I've dubbed this year the year of the wellbeing leader. Like, certainly in the UK, I'm obsessed with this idea that dedicated roles are really important. That they've taken a bit of I don't know what it's about like in your part of the world, but they have taken a bit of a knock, it's certainly over the last couple of years about what is the impact they're having. There was a recent study that came out, you may have seen it, by the University of Oxford, where they found that individual well-being interventions don't work. Did you see that? Now, that's a whole thing because they weren't quite claiming that as strongly as the headline suggests. But what really interested me about it was how the media and LinkedIn and all the rest of it jumped on it, and it was almost like, look, it doesn't work. That they were delighted to see that something showed it didn't work. And I was like, number one, it doesn't show that it doesn't work, because if you read the study properly, you'll see it's a bit more complex than that. But number two, why are you so desperate to see this fail? I don't know. Yeah.
I don't know. I think that's pretty. I'd say that is very sort of natural in the sense of going, I don't understand it, we don't have to do it. Excellent. Yeah. So and it's confirmation bias to me, like kind of going like, oh, I don't get it, so I'm going to gather all the information that I can to affirm my opinion that it's stupid and I don't need to think about it. So I think that's been going on for a long period of time. And I think also when we have had wellbeing solutions in the past, as we know, that have been for people just giving it a go and not evidence-based, then we do end up in a position where it's that sort of overcorrection. And I think that speaks to, the thinking behind my ridiculously long and silly, perhaps, role title. Because yes, there's well-being there, but to do that, it's through psych risk. So it's a sort of saying we're not doing this stuff just by itself, but there's actually a method, as we've discussed. Yeah, I think but it doesn't mean that, people don't just look at the well-being stuff and go, did you see that study in Oxford?
Yeah. And as psychologists, you and I look at that sort of study and I'm like, that's great. That's what we need to do. We need to be critical about our own work, but that's not how LinkedIn works. It's bad.
I don't. I think, is
It's
it
bad.
a LinkedIn problem? I think that might be a LinkedIn problem. No, but I think that's something actually that it speaks to a wider problem that's happening around, which is the refuting of science, and the moving away from evidence-based and critical thinking approaches. Because absolutely, I agree that I think that we would obviously advocate for that. And, one of the other key features of a wellbeing leader, I think you need to be able to change your mind. But that's what's sat, I think, with being trained in as a psychologist, because you are trained, so heavily not to fight your biases, right? And they're going to come up and you just have to notice them and work your way through them. So I think that's the sort of same proposition there, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. It does. That makes sense to me. Whether it makes sense to anyone else, it makes sense to me. Absolutely. Do you mind if I ask you, just as we're kind of closing up, about your current role a little bit? You talked about the method around psychosocial risk, and I kind of pulled that thread a little bit earlier. But what other kind of practical things you find yourself doing day to day?
Ooh, that's a good question. I think, again, because it's early days, a lot of it is about really getting to understand the business properly. It's a behemoth. We're in 40 plus countries. We have, manufacturing as well as the corporate elements in the offices in our organization. It's not just two. There's 1,000 different sort of ways. There's been, it's in the news, so it's not a surprise, but we're going through a $1.4 billion divestment. So there's a lot of organizational change going on. So it's really sort of getting to understand the business and making connections with key partners like HR, of course, but also with our operations teams, and really just sort of getting familiar with channels in how to communicate and how our message can kind of float, and risk assessment, like risk assessment particularly as well. So some areas of the business we would do that before others. So for Australia, it's legislated. So that's where we start there, and then we kind of move out. But it's very rarely do we sort of roll out a one size fits all approach. So it's very much relationship building, comms, really getting to know where these messages would really hit, and what works. That makes sense.
Yeah, it does, and it's really interesting, right? Because you're expected to. Well, one thing you didn't mention there was just well-being interventions. As you say, you don't start with let's chuck some well-being interventions at people, because then it's not evidence-based. You've got to do that groundwork, and you said you're relatively new into the role, but you said a year, right?
Yeah, I've been there 8 months. So the team's
Right.
been around for a year, but yeah, I've been here for about eight or 9 months. So yeah, it is early days, and it is tempting to just kind of go, but yeah, look, just do this and this, and but that's the surefire way to annoy people, I think. And also that some things do work for some people. It's just about where is the best use of resources, because that is a constraint. But where's going to make the biggest impact to our people, then where are we going to pull them away from what they're doing, and do it properly, versus, because if we don't do it properly, then you get that sentiment of like, oh, this is all rubbish. It didn't work for me. So, which is understandable.
But even the way that you're talking about that, you're saying your early days, 8 months, it's a decent amount of time in the sense that it sounds like you're playing.
Give me a break here.
Well, no, but it sounds like no, but I'm meaning it as a compliment. It sounds like you're playing the long game. That I've seen people go into these roles and they're potentially just because they're so passionate about well-being, and they're like, everybody should love this thing that I love, and they want to change the world in 3 months. They want to come in and launch this well-being festival that will suddenly change everybody's lives. It's like, no, you've got to play the long game with this stuff. You've said 8 months, we're early days, we're still building the foundations, building the relationships, communication is key. And then it's, what does the long-term strategy look like after that?
Yeah. I think that though speaks to one of my sort of, I joke with sort of marketing teams, not necessarily at Fonterra, but around, and go like, can you make psych risk sexy? Like, because like, how do we compete with, bringing dogs into workplaces and, mindfulness corners and all that sort of stuff that we know can have an impact on individual well-being. But again, it's the degree to which it does. Like, how can we compete with that when I'm saying things like, I've got a survey, if you could just fill that out, then we can look at your incident register, and then maybe we can kind of tackle on. Like, it's so boring, right, compared to being able to have a wellbeing festival. Like, that sounds pretty cool. I want to do that.
Maybe if the dog delivered the survey, then yeah.
You've broken the back of it, mate. That's it. This is... I love
Maybe
it.
that's why organisations work with me,
Write it down.
I was going to ask about the risk assessment. So, again, if you don't mind me asking, and feel free to not answer this, but what does a risk assessment look like in your organisation? Do you do it like across the whole organisation? What's the regularity of that, or is it more an individual tool?
Oh, that is such a good question. And that's where I go back to reinforcing, and this is not for you, of course, but just to anyone who's listening, that a risk assessment isn't always a survey, and it's more than that, right? So, I say that what's the most common risk assessment that you do every day, and especially to leaders, but it's to everybody. And that's when you turn to somebody and you say, hey, how you doing? Like, that's a formal risk assessment, right? It's not, we know we have to have formal and informal, but making sure that we don't miss the breadth of that. There are those that are more frequent. When we want to do hotspotting, we'll go into a smaller part and look at it in more detail. If we are doing it section by section, we will tend to use a tool just so we get the breadth, but you can also do it with focus groups as well. You don't need to use a tool. I think a lot of organizations get really stuck on it, and then they get all these numbers back and they go, what do I do with this? To me, always make sure that you know that you can do something with the information that you're asking for. And I think that's really sort of helped a lot of people become unstuck in the past, where they've done this whole wide-reaching risk assessment across an organization. They've come back with all these numbers and they're like, where do we even start? And by the time they get to, a division down the road, it's been 2 years since they've said it, what are you doing? So I think know what it is that you can do. Where you can't, what are your other solutions? But typically you need to start small, not too small, but you need to sort of break it off in chunks, because in an organization of this size, because if you don't, you're just going to miss, and you'll annoy people when you do. So.
Yeah, it's a key lesson. Don't annoy people. Don't annoy people.
Well, yeah. Like, I'd be annoyed if someone asked me questions and then was radio silence for 2 years. And they're real stories. Not obviously organizations I've worked in, but,
Of course not.
It really happens.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to make it even more complicated, I read a study last week, actually, came out of a university in Stockholm in Sweden, and it was a fairly small sample size, so that not a huge study, but they also showed the role that personality and seasonality plays on how people perceive psychosocial risk. I'll have to send it you, although
please,
when I was
do.
reading
I've not
it,
seen that one.
although when I was reading it, I was like, oh God, this just makes it even harder, because what they were basically saying was that you do a risk assessment in the summer, and if you're responding to that in the winter or in the fall, it's a completely different picture, just because people that their perceptions of psychosocial risk change, and they had data to show this just because of the seasons. And then you lay up with personality on top of that, and it changes because of that as well. People who are neuroticism see those differences, a bigger swing in those differences than those who are higher in extroversion, for example. I was reading that, I was thinking, oh God, maybe I just put this in a cupboard and forget about that.
but then how does that, like, we can see how that happens, right? We can see how the overwhelm of like, but if I do this, then I've got to do this, and I've got to do this, and it won't be perfect. It'll be messy. Like, my research was in psychometrics and scale development, and so I look at a lot of the scales we use, and just like, there's a part of me that just breaks every time I just want to see like the not only that, but how it's delivered, and it's not done uniformly. And sometimes you just got to let it go and go, is something that is 80%, 70 better than 0? Yes, it is. Like, but are we going to say that the results of this are definitive and it will, drive our wellbeing strategy for the next 6 to 12 months? That would be silly. So that's why you need to use that multimodal assessment and use a number of things rather than, and that's why I stress that point of it. It's not just the survey because of those reasons. So it's really well highlighted by that study, I think, even though it's overwhelming.
Yeah, and I feel like you were talking directly to me there when I look at organization surveys that they've got, especially around psychosocial risk, because that's my bag. And well, no, but and when I read them, and I'm like, how do I slag this off without pissing them off? Like, yeah.
That's my secondary sort of byline. No, like spend a lot of time trying to do that. Yeah, try not to do that, I should say.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, look, the time has flown by. I've probably got 100 more questions. I could ask you all day about psychosocial risk. It's the geekiest conversation. We could just talk about psychosocial risk for hours and hours and hours, but we won't. We won't do it. I'll leave it there. So thank you so much for your time today. Are there any other questions that you wish I'd asked you that you think
That's a good one.
hard one to answer?
Yeah, and it's a really hard one to answer. No, I think that there's always the one about making sure that the people who are dealing in wellbeing are looking after their own wellbeing. I think, and ensuring that we have a focus on that. I think that's really important. And I think, again, that's part of being a psychologist. You got to do that. You've got to get supervision to make sure that you are looking after yourself. But I think, especially when we have those that worked in lived experience, etc., like I think there's a real temptation to be so passionate and to burn yourself out. And, the irony there is, is not ideal. Yeah, I think focusing on your own well-being is really important.
That's a really good point. Although I didn't ask you about it because of the time difference, I've asked you to record this podcast at 9 o'clock at night.
Do as I say, not as I do. Isn't that what?
This is different though. This isn't work.
That's damn. No, you're absolutely right. But we can make exceptions. We just got to make sure that it doesn't become, a regular part of it. And I'll adjust my my working hours accordingly. So
absolutely. I'll speak to you tomorrow then. No. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for the conversation today. Honestly, there's so many great kind of tips in there and bits, really interesting bits in there that I feel like I'm going to listen to this one back because I want to. I made a few notes as I was going through. I was like, oh, I need to pick up on that one because it's a really good point.
Cool.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you for your time. The last question I always ask people on the podcast is where people can find them. Again, if you want people finding you, but if anybody wants to find out more about you and the work that you do.
Oh gosh, yeah. I guess just on LinkedIn. It's not that I sort of am feverishly updating it, but yeah, that's probably, especially being internal, that's probably the best way. Yeah, it might not be exhaustive, but there might be a little bit on there, and I'm always happy to have a chat and say good day.
Perfect. Right. Thank you again.
My pleasure. Thanks so much, Matt.
Hopefully see you again soon.